for those churches that we opened. Now, God was preparing me. He called me to be a pioneer pastor, and He was preparing me to do a job. And if I was being blessed in that church all the time, I would have never left that church. I would have stayed right where I was at. I was basking in the things of God. I was seeing things happen. Even though God was beginning to call me into the ministry, I was happy. I mean, I was happy, man. I was happy like I had a bowl of food here and a bowl of food here and a bowl of food there. It was just good food, you know. I was where I could eat continually. And yet it didn't look good to me. Nothing looked good to me. God was preparing me for what He wanted me to do in my lifetime. And from that moment on, whenever God was getting ready to move me to another location, something inside of me began to die. Something inside of me, when I would come in to worship or I would come in to preach, there was something missing in my life. Though the people didn't know it, I could feel it. I could sense it. When I go to prepare a message, I had battles just getting a message together. I couldn't figure what God really wanted me to preach. After you preach so many years, it don't take a whole lot of figuring. You can get up there and just about preach on anything, you know, after all those years. But what I'm trying to say to you, church, is sometimes when you feel like that you're in a desert spot, you feel like that God's deserted you, feel like that nothing's happening in your life, and you wonder why everybody else is excited about something and you can't get yourself excited about it. God may be getting ready to move you to another level in your life. It may not be going out and starting a church. It might not be going out into the ministry, but He's getting ready to move you to another area in your life where you're going to be more fruitful than you ever were in the past. And God doesn't, you know, He didn't come knocking on my door and send some preacher to me and say, you're supposed to be over at another place. This is where God wants you. He didn't do that. He dealt with me on every church that I went to. God dealt with me in the same manner every time. And then after a while, He began to deal with me. And while I was pastoring the church, I pioneered a church. And the last one I pioneered was in Lakeland. I was pastoring the church. We were running right around 200 people. And my wife, I saw that she wasn't really busy. The kids wasn't really doing a whole lot. And I went for a ride in Lakeland, and I found an empty church building. And guess what happened? God said, I want you to get that. I mean, He didn't speak with an audible voice, but I felt it, you know. It was like I found what I've been looking for. So I stopped, and I got an address, and I got a phone number, and I contacted the people that owned it. And I bought that church for $25,000 at $125 a week or a month and no interest. And so we began, so I come home and I broke the news to my wife. Oh, now you got something to do. You don't have to just sit around anymore. With 200 people, can you figure just sitting around? And we lived closer there than we lived here. That church was almost inside. The parsonage was almost in the church. It was just a short walk. So we started, and I rented that building. And within 6 months, we were running close to 50 people. I would on Sunday morning, I would have Sunday school at 8 o'clock at the church in Lakeland, and then be back at 9:30 for the church here. I had it set to where I could have both Sunday school and worship, be back to my home church for Sunday school and worship. No, I take that back. I didn't make Sunday school. I got back just for the worship. And then on 5 o'clock on Sunday evening, one church, 7 o'clock, back to the other church, and we did that. And then my wife said, you know what, you're about to kill me. So I said, you know, like a good husband, I made all the excuses I could think of. God's one told me to do it. You have to carry your conversation over with Him. Well, she said, if you're His agent, it will deal with you. So anyhow, she did. And so I knew I couldn't carry that on for a long time. And so we had an 80-some-year-old man in the church. And in Lakeland, there was a 70-some-year-old man, or woman, almost 80 years old, and somehow they met. And I was going to do their wedding. And And so this was getting to be something else. And so then when we did the wedding, they had a son that they were simply God's preachers. The whole family, and the husband had died. And so now they have boys, and one of them, man, he stand out, and his suits almost shined. I mean, he was eloquent in everything he done, and he was a tremendous, tremendous evangelist. And then they had a son that was kind of like you, just like me, you know. Whatever I put on, if my wife okayed it, I walked out the door with it on. None of my suits ever shined, and I just was a preacher, a pastor. Well, he came to the wedding, and my wife got talking to him and found out that he wasn't going to church. And she got all over him. And she began to build a relationship with him. And she built that relationship and said, why did you walk away from God? He stuttered all the time. He couldn't just talk, he stuttered all the time. And so he said that he began to, and if I start stuttering, I can't stop it. So anyhow, he stuttered, and he told her, this is the reason why. They told me I'd never amount to anything. My brother's the one that's the success of the ministry. I never will have anything in the ministry. My wife said to him, that's stupid, knock it off. That's stupid. And so she began to work with him, got him to come to church. And he went to that altar and turned his life back over to God. His wife was there with him, his family. And after about 3 months of becoming faithful to church, God spoke to my heart about asking him to be pastor of that church. Not only did he speak to me, but at the same time, he spoke to my wife, and she made the suggestion, have you thought about Raymond for that church? So I went to him and I asked him, I said, Raymond, what would you think about pastoring that church? And it was only about 3 or 4 city blocks from the big church that his dad pastored. And he said, well, I don't know. I'll have to pray about that. Because he said, you know, I'm a loser. Yeah, so he come back about a week or 2 later and said, Pastor, if you'll trust me, I'll try. We put him in that church. We put him in that church. In just a short time, he filled the building to capacity. Not only did he fill the building to capacity, but he went in front of that, because we had an acre of land, he went in front of it, and he built a huge church for God. It was packed, solid with people. He took that little old building that I went by and saw, and God spoke to my heart. But all the time, Raymond's gone through a desert. He's gone through a hard place. Been told he didn't amount to anything. He would never amount to the ministry when his heart ached to be in the ministry, but because he stuttered. And I want to tell you something. When that man stood to the pulpit and began to preach, he never stuttered one time. He'd walk out of that pulpit, you'd have to listen. And whenever time I got around one of those guys and they started stuttering, and I started talking to them, I started stuttering. So I had to learn to keep my mouth shut. I don't know what it was, but anyhow, what I'm saying to you is God sometimes takes us to a desert place to put us where he wants us. But he never leaves us in the desert. We're only going through the desert. Moses was in the desert for 40 years. I didn't have to stay 40 years. It didn't take that long for me to know what God was saying. And about every time that I moved, every time that I started the church, every time, it was like I would dry up where I was at. And then God would just explode on the other side. And we saw great things happen. Great things happen. So what I'm trying to say to you simply tonight is this, that if the God's putting the heat on you, and you're feeling the heat, you feel like you're in a desert place, and the worship is just not what it seems to be. The message is not exactly what they seem to be. You might find, I'm sitting in that church and I'm listening to them preach, and I'm not getting anything out of it. Nothing's happening. I need fed. It isn't that you need fed. God's trying to talk to you, and he's wanting to get your attention. And he has to pull it away from other people in order to get your attention. And sometimes when we feel like that we've lost and we're not being fed, or the song service is not what it ought to be, I just can't get into it. God most likely is dealing with you because he wants to take you to another plane where he can use you and bless you. God doesn't leave you on the same plane all of your life.